Convulsions of nations and classes at the margin and center of European capitalism in the age of globalization. Globalization and historical materialism. The truncated language of the bourgeoisie and those who preach all its novelties has, for some time now, adopted the term globalization to indicate that complex network of commercial, productive, financial and political links that characterize the competitive relations between companies, economies, bourgeoisies and states, with all their propaganda apparatus, diplomatic and military apparatus, on a planetary scale, and which for Marxists has always constituted, on the one hand, the normal unfolding of the development of capitalist relations of production in the age of imperialism, and, on the other hand, once the relations between classes and between the different modes of production are added, that monistic interrelationship between social facts on an extended scale, in space and time, on which historical materialism is founded. This is to immediately sweep away any element of alleged novelty with which one might possibly want to confuse a serious analysis of the current contradictory and conflicting relations for the partitioning of the world market, but be careful with this definition too, because this already existed in power in the 17th century, between large, medium and small imperialists. Worse still, if such terms were to be used to endorse supposed novelties in the field of class relations and new developments in them within brand new spheres of conflict. We need only refer once again to the manifesto of the Communist Party which, in the chapter Bourgeois and Proletarians, stated thus: the discovery of America, the circumnavigation of Africa created a new terrain for the bourgeoisie source. The East India and Chinese market, the colonization of America, the trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and goods in general gave trade, navigation and industry a hitherto unknown impetus, and thereby impressed a rapid development on the revolutionary element within the disintegrating feudal society. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without continually revolutionizing the instruments of production, the relations of production, and thus all social relations. The continual revolution of production, the uninterrupted shaking up of all social situations, the eternal uncertainty and movement distinguish the epoch of the bourgeoisie from all previous epochs. With the exploitation of the world market, the bourgeoisie has given a cosmopolitan imprint to production and consumption in all countries. It has pulled industry out from under the feet of its national terrain, much to the chagrin of reactionaries. It is forcing all nations to adopt the bourgeois system of production if they do not want to go to ruin. It is forcing them to introduce so-called civilization at home, i.e. to become bourgeois. It has created huge cities, it has increased on a grand scale the figure of the urban population in comparison to the rural population, thus wrenching a considerable part of the population away from the idiotism of rural life. The bourgeoisie increasingly eliminates the dispersion of the means of production, property and population. It has agglomerated the population, centralized the means of production and concentrated property in a few hands. Political centralization has been a necessary consequence of this. Geopolitics or geo-historical areas? Another term back in vogue, after decades of enforced oblivion, in journalistic and political parlance is instead geopolitics. This term, which originated more or less in the years when modern imperialism took hold, i.e. at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, indicates in political, diplomatic and military language an area of strategic interests, both economically and militarily, vital for a given country or, to put it more accurately, national capitalism. It is useless to trace its history and architects here. What is certain is that this vision of the dislocation of interests, borders and alliances was also born planetary. It carried and was in itself, yesterday as today, a manifestation of the need for each individual capital and or national capitalism to expand as much as possible, concentrating and centralizing along historically given lines and to the detriment of all possible competitors. From the thread of time the planet is small is worth quoting. A so-called recent science, geopolitics, is in fashion. It wants to study the geography of the planet in its incessant changes due to the stay and work of man. It is a branch of science that has understood that the laws of historical facts are not discovered in the traces they have left in the individual's brain, but in the actual physics of ponderable objects. Americans, Russians, Germans, if they cook it up according to the orders of their superiors, nevertheless refer to a master who wrote around 1919, the English geographer Mackinder. Today, he wrote, the map of the Earth is completely drawn, there are no more white spots on the globe. The physical, economic, political and military factors now form a coordinated system. The bourgeois learn from Marxism, the alleged proletarian exponents throw it out. Highlighted by us. Sometimes the term geoeconomics, particularly used in Italy by the Agnelli Foundation Brain Trust, is preferred, but little changes the underlying meaning and purpose of its use. Here too, once freed from useless trappings and bourgeois ideological embellishments, Marxists recognize, under another term, a particularly important concept from their theoretical baggage or, for the more refined palates, from their philosophical dictionary. We are talking about geohistorical areas, i.e. territorial spaces in which the evolution of the productive forces and their underlying relations of production has created the basis for a unitary revolutionary transformation that transcends the narrow and petty spaces and timescales of the orbiting bourgeois conception of the nation-state. In Russia and Revolution in Marxist theory we find. In many previous treatises this term of area has been used, perhaps insufficiently, but one cannot see a better one. Area is a purely geometric concept, to measure an extension of surface enclosed by a contour. It is hardly used as a geophysical concept, and less so as a geoanthropic one. However, we cannot use the term nation, because our fields can encompass several nations. We cannot use the term state, because for a state is defined only for one factor by territory, and for the other by class relations, as well as for the same reason that the fields considered are also of several states. Today, diplomats use the term region in the sense not of part of a state, but of a group of states, when they speak of regional agreements, but the term is too closely related to the sense of the part of a nation. The term country is not suitable, because it is used for territories both large and very small. As for the term zone, it is suitable for geophysical use, little for geopolitical use. We will therefore continue to use the term area, which the Americans have introduced to designate parts of the inhabited world in which there is an economy, a currency, a political influence, although the expression historical field would be less displeasing. It is in fact each time a question of linking a determined geographical perimeter to a determined chronological interval. This last emphasis is ours. It is clear that revolutionary areas are not watertight compartments. On the contrary, if one moves, even on social postulates of its own, it generally triggers revolutionary movements in all the others, even if they are of a different degree of development. Here, it must be understood, we are talking about all modes of production of all the revolutions that have followed one another, even with different modes and results, on the globe. Petty and ideological is still the imperialist vision of geopolitics, clustered around national interest or a clique of gangsters in double-breasted or camouflage uniform. Underneath, however, the old mole is digging, and so, even if political revolutions are slow in coming, distant territories are brought closer, outdated barriers are abolished, archaic covenants, classes, and forms of production are shattered and rendered obsolete by facts. Idols are shattered and altars are toppled so that what in the eyes of the petty bourgeois may seem an irreparable defeat in the eyes of the revolutionary will shine as a sign of future victory. The historical concentration of capitalism. These premises were necessary in order to introduce the question of the current state of world imperialism and the implications that its contradictions are beginning to have in central areas or close to one of its centers. Apparently, the Balkan question, as it has been redelineated since 1991 up to the most recent events in Albania, and the maneuvers to speed up or slow down the process of European economic unification would seem to belong to different spheres, in contact with each other only for reasons of propaganda or instrumental political and humanitarian fanfare. In reality, and this will be demonstrated here, the deep forces behind this are closely intertwined and destined to be of interest, this strategic interest, to revolutionaries. Provided, of course, that we reject all kinds of blinkers and instrumentation not traceable to the Marxist armory. To begin with, one cannot help but define the vast geo-historical area pivoting on the Rhine axis, or rather on that portion of European territory gravitating from south to north on the territories bordering the course of the Rhine River. Here, roughly from north-central Italy to the Netherlands, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, taking into account not only the Alpine passes and the important transversal communication axes formed by the Po Valley or the canals linking the Rhine to the Danube to the east and the Marne and the Atlantic to the west, but also of the dense network of roads still winding along the ancient Roman road axes. The most ancient heart of capitalism has developed and pulsates, and at the same time, taking into account the territorial contiguity between city and city, between industrial and financial areas, and the immense concentration of capital and labor force, the largest megalopolis on the planet has formed. This geo-historical area encompasses the south-north expansion axis of the Roman Empire and that of the medieval Holy Roman Empire, the areas of influence of Genoa, Venice, Florence and Milan of the heroic age of the Italian municipal bourgeoisie, the territory of the contested Burgundian state, the textile and mercantile centers of Flanders for which the kings of France and England were already at each other's throats for 100 years. The German cities of the Hanseatic League and the first fully bourgeois oceanic power, that of 17th century Holland, roughly correspond to what is commonly referred to as Western Europe. Figures from the early 1990s, in a ranking that divided the world into 10 major pan-regions, for us, geo-historical areas, i.e. Europe, Russia, North America, Latin America, Brazil, Oceania, East Asia, South Asia, the Islamic world and Africa, gave it first place in terms of wealth produced. This meant 33.6% of the world product, an average of $6,818 billion per year, against 29.5% for North America, $5,900 billion, and 20.4% for East Asia, $4,136 billion altogether. 83.5% of the world product concentrated in the three imperialist blocs contending the planet. Even from the point of view of trade, the first place went to Europe since it held, again according to data from the beginning of the decade, 28% of world exports against 20% for the Pacific area, Japan, Southeast Asia and Australia, and 15.5% for North America. In order to better measure the vertical economic and financial concentration that takes place in certain key areas of the planet, bourgeois econometrics devised the economic density gradient that relates per capita income to the population density of a certain area, an area once again understood not as a nation but as a significant region of a continent or state. With due caution, such a measure can yield some significant results. Taking this gradient into account, we can obtain, given that the population density on the face of the Earth varies from over 1,000 to less than 1 inhab per square kilometer, and that the average income per inhab varies from less than $100 to more than $20,000, an enormous range of variation in the distribution of wealth. We thus have from less than $100 per square kilometer for the poorest and least populated regions to more than $100 million per square kilometer in the large hegemonic urban regions. The 6 urban regions of London, Paris, Antwerp, Brussels, Ramstad, Holland, Cologne, Rouen, and Milan constitute the pinnacles of the territorial organization of the heart of Europe with 51 million inhabitants, 53,000 square kilometers, almost 1,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. The rest of this strong area consists of a connective tissue of smaller metropolises, regions of widespread industry, areas of intensive agriculture, and tourist areas. Altogether another 135 million inhabitants, but with a density 6 times lower than that of the largest urban regions. In the urban regions of Europe, the density of economic concentration is 21.2 million per square kilometre, and in the regions of strong connective tissue, 3.2 million per square kilometre. In the equivalent large urban regions of the USA, we arrive at an average economic density of $11.6 million per square kilometre, and in the areas of strong connective tissue at $1.7 million per square kilometre. The only area that significantly exceeds Europe's large urban regions in terms of the economic density gradient is the Tokyo-Osaka megalopolis, which comes to $39 million per square kilometre. The territorial scale is smaller in this case, however. Let us suspend here for now a listing of statistical data. Remember that they date back to 1990, that would still need to be updated and expanded so as to go beyond the limits of this report. What is important to glimpse is how verifiable is an economic financial concentration that is progressive and subjugates entire areas of the globe to a very few centres, which substantially shrink to 3 and which in turn shrink within themselves into narrow, well-defined areas in which much of the world's wealth ends up being concentrated. A few more figures to better understand what follows. In 1990 there was a total production of goods and services in the world that was measured at $20,300 billion, read $2,300 billion. Of this world product, 16%, or $3.2 trillion, was used outside the producing countries in the form of exports. It follows that a large part of the product was consumed internally. However, if we split this total product among the producers, we can see that in 1990, $6 trillion was produced by North America, USA and Canada. $335 billion in the ocean area of Australia and New Zealand. $3,140 billion in the Far East area, basically Japan and New Tigers.
$6,300 billion in Western Europe.
Altogether, out of $20,300 billion, 15,775 were produced in OECD countries. Shall we look in even more detail? The United States alone produced $5,552 billion, Japan alone $2,939, and Germany alone $1,559. If, in the end, we wanted to do the maths with the $3.2 trillion of goods and services for export in 1990, we could still see how some $1.1 trillion was exported by their usual 3, in the following order: Germany $415 billion of exported goods, the United States $394 billion, and Japan with $288 billion of exports. Let us stop here, recalling how concentration of wealth is also concentration of production. The Rhenish magnet and world imperialism. We have not yet arranged, alongside the previous ones, taken mainly from 3 texts by Roberto Mainardi, Professor of Geography at the University of Milan, Geographia Generale, Geographia Regionale and l'Europa Germanica, all published by La Nuova Italia Scientifica, more recent statistical data, but, even admitting some changes in the order of the values exposed, the substantial datum remains. In one of the hearts of world capitalism with German reunification, the 3rd of October, 1990, something has begun to move and march at a fast pace. But the unification itself was in turn the product of more or less distant and recent events, the trend towards the unification of the European Economic Area, the collapse of Eastern regimes, which can only be partially touched upon on this occasion. What is certain is that the European centre of gravity for the 3rd time in a century is shifting eastwards again, as the German capital moves from Bonn to Berlin. However, this shift of the axis is not a geophysical phenomenon, but a geo-economic one. For reasons of time, it is not possible here to carry out a more detailed report on the development of German history and the role that the growth and maturation of capitalism has played in it and its neighbouring countries, especially to the east. This topic has already been dealt with on another occasion, on the track of texts by Marx, Engels and the left, and is the subject of a future report or letter. What is certain is that with the redefinition of a European space whose hinges lie between Berlin, the Netherlands, Paris and the Po Valley, we are faced with a problem of political, economic and military unification that already gripped Frederick II of Swabia, Charles V, Louis XIV, Napoleon and Hitler. Let it be clear, however, that here the names of the bourgeoisie are used in exactly the opposite way. It is not their fine thoughts, or their governments, that decide the course of events, but it is the latter that once set in motion must find, no matter whether in a royal lineage or an Austrian corporal, its vector. What was the problem that gripped these puppets of history in different ways, forms and times? The maintenance of a centralized network and the realization of unified economic and political functions between the economic areas of Central Europe and the coastal economic areas, towards the Atlantic, the North Sea, the Baltic and the Mediterranean, an essential basis, at least since Louis XIV, for countering the dominance of the oceanic powers, Holland in the 17th century, England in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the United States in the 20th. A common corollary of all these attempts to control the east-west and north-south axis on European territory was that of overcoming the Roman limes, basically along the course of the Rhine, which ran as a frontier from the North Sea to the Alps and strategically separated the plains and plateaus of the center from the Atlantic and Western Mediterranean communication routes. That is to say, the Rhine axis is the heart of ancient capitalism, but if it is to continue to prosper, it must not be a limit for itself. If anyone thinks that airlines and computer networks have made the problem obsolete, try moving raw materials and manufactured goods along them. Letter number 35 partially addressed the problem of the Maastricht Treaty and its difficult, if not impossible, realization, since this programmatic agreement certainly arose from the various requirements listed above, but it still seems to respond more to the internal needs of each individual nation in the European mosaic or to the more general need to grow without benefiting partners rather than to those of a centralized command and management unit to replace the aforementioned bickering. Certainly, the central banks, and in particular the Bundesbank, seem to be closer to the task than the charlatan EU political bodies, such as the Strasbourg Parliament, with their multifaceted chirping. On the other hand, if in 1994 currency trading reached 10 times the world's product, i.e. $300,000 billion, compared to $2,000 billion in 1970 and $35,000 billion, also in dollars, in 1984, equal to $900 billion a day and 25 times the trade in goods and services. This means that in an age of financial imperialism, the scepter must necessarily pass to the central banks. And so while the whining of the bourgeoisie about the end of the politicians' autonomy is being raised, the Marxists see their theses about the dominance of financial capital fully confirmed. But then since 1916, the year Lenin's imperialism was published, has nothing really changed? In fact, from 1919 Wall Street replaced the City of London as the most important centre of financial intermediation, and from 1944, with the Bretton Woods treaties, sterling was replaced by the dollar as the medium of international exchange and payment. In short, 2 world wars shifted the world financial axis from Pale Albion to Uncle Sam. The United States emerged from the First World War as the leading creditor nation. Whereas between 1870 and 1913 and then in the 1920s capital flows consisted mainly of private funds, after the Second World War official foreign aid assumed a major role. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States from 1949 to 1952 provided Western Europe with aid amounting to 4.5% of the U.S. gross national product, the equivalent, in 1991 dollars, of $250 billion. We quote again from Maynardi's text on page 212. In 1913 Britain, the hegemonic power in the world economy, had foreign investments amounting to more than an annuity of its GNP, which yielded capital incomes equal to 9% of national income. The capital income offset the trade deficit. From the economist Geminello Olvi we instead borrow the following remarks. In 1993, the U.S. merchandise deficit amounted to 2.5% of its gross domestic product. In 1913, the UK had a merchandise deficit of 6.7% of its GNP. But whereas Treasury Islands income earners had accumulated foreign assets in 1913 amounting to 158% of gross domestic product, the US's only amounted 80 years later to just over 40% of net domestic product. The US is indeed, as the UK once was, the world's largest importer of goods. Still, like the British in 1913, they are the richest nation. But compared to the UK of yesteryear, they have an unnatural balance of payments in sea, and meagre foreign assets. Sorry, but so much for triumphant liberalism. In 1981, the US was still the largest creditor country. The net creditor position was valued at $141 billion, 4% of their GNP. Income from foreign investments provided 1% of GNP. In just 5 years, the US became a net debtor to the tune of $264 billion in 1986. In 1990, the balance of capital payments became negative and the net debtor position rose to $700 billion, equal to 15% of GNP that year. It had never happened before that the leading economic power was also the leading debtor. Any increase in the vulnerability of the US economy to external events, increased competitiveness, gained leading positions, higher productivity and lower labor costs, is bound to weaken the dollar's role in the international market. It has thus fallen from an 80% to 60% share in world foreign exchange reserves, while the mark's share has risen from 2% to 14% and that of the yen from almost 0 to 7%. More from Maynardi. Japan became the main creditor in the 1980s, $220 billion in 1986, $500 billion in 1990. The yen is already the second currency in the international capital markets. But Japan is reluctant to favor greater use of the yen as an international currency. Only 40% of Japanese exports and a very modest 10% of imports are invoiced in yen. With the relative decline of the dollar, 3 monetary spaces tend to form: the European monetary system, dominated by the mark, the Asia-Pacific region, and the Americas. This is what was intended to be achieved through the use of the dry data. The Marxist theory of imperialism is not in the slightest bit shaken by an 80-year excursus. The knife-edge struggle for financial concentration remains, the progressive difficulties of accumulation and valorization as well. This is confirmed by the Frenchman Alain Mink from the pages of the Corriere della Sera of the 6th of November, 1996. In the coming years there will be a tough and objective conflict. It will be the conflict between the dollar and the euro. The birth of the single European currency will be the most violent blow ever delivered to the dominant position of the United States. Grandeur often makes one forget, however, that it is precisely the difficult agreement on the weight and role of the different European national currencies, read economies, within the single currency that is holding back this formidable blow. Steel, coins, and pushes. The dictats of Theo Waigel and the Bundesbank, the complaints of the governor of the Banca d'Italia, Faccio, when he declared before the European Parliament, on the 25th of September, 1995, that Europe's difficulty in putting the Maastricht Treaty into practice lay in the fact that it could not avail itself of a single central government like that of the United States for a territory of the same size. But with almost 300 million inhabitants, all this confirms what has always been very clear to the left. Rigid economic and political centralization is an inescapable necessity for capitalism. So on with the interest rate maneuvers, with the jostling not to be left out of the gala dinner, but with attention to making the table neighbor look bad, so that he is kicked out or leaves voluntarily, as in the best Versailles tradition. But this concentrated, centralized, accumulated capital must go back to being what it is in its innermost essence, value in process. That is to say, it can never stop. It can perhaps try the ploys of financial speculation, but the more money, finding no way out of valorization in the production process, becomes capital in itself, the closer the times of its disappearance get. It must therefore find and rediscover the times, ways, and forms of its own valorization.
The bleibt Utopia in his blame friend Hitler, has Gustav Krupp say.
The Krupp firm is not guided by the will of its president, it acts in deference to the will of steel, to the wishes of steel, to the dream, hear me well, conceived by steel. The Krupp family must realize the dreams of steel at any cost. His Majesty Steel is entitled a thread of time, in which this fruit of the fusion of minerals neither rare nor noble is taken as the parameter and motor of the development of capitalism and the contradictions between imperialisms. This whirling motion of capital, in its attempt to find new impulses for its own valorization and commercial outlets for the results of its production processes, however, does not only cause movements, changes, and contradictions at its summit and in its center, but also at its periphery and, of necessity, or we would not be here to discuss it, among the groups of those who with their labor must transfer this valorization to capital itself. What happens, and has happened in this respect in the heart or on the fringes of the Rhine Magnet, will still serve us as an example and framework for interpretation. Economic regions and German hegemony. Walter Christoller is the name of a German geographer who from the early 1930s, with a work entitled The Central Locations of Southern Germany, gave impetus to a particular branch of geography called functional geography. This science studies the territory starting from the capacity of attraction that certain central areas, usually large and medium-sized urban centers, have on the surrounding territory as polarizers of economic and administrative activities. From this point of view, the geographical space becomes a more or less intricate fabric of areas that influence each other reciprocally, either suffering the greater functional weight of certain centers or competing to assert their centrality. It is a vision that presupposes a certain degree of urbanization, and it is no coincidence that the initial case study was based on a particularly urbanized area such as southern Germany. Let there be no fear, we have not fallen in love with De Agostini's Atlas calendar, nor are we engaging in academia. Nor, much less, are we interested in fleecing Christoller as to whether or not he was pan-Germanist. What Marxists are given to grasping in the functional study of urban settlements is that the economic and political centralization of capitalism is materially verifiable on the territory, not only across national borders, but on either side of them, through the influence that financial and industrial poles of different hierarchical order have on the surrounding areas on a scale ranging from the few dozen kilometers traveled daily by commuting workers or border crossers to the 100,000 square kilometers over, which the influence of the most important metropolises is exerted on average today. Is this not a magnificent proof of what was said in the beginning through the pages of the Communist Party manifesto? Geographical science has already had to take note of what the nationalist and petty bourgeois political vision refuses to discuss. The concepts of region, in the sense illustrated earlier by the quotations from the thread of time, and pan-region, bypassing localist and nationalist taboos, put on the agenda the end of social relations based on the idea of the nation-state or, even worse, ethnicity, and reveal more transparently that it is the modes and relations of production that determine the forms of organization and aggregation of societies. Let us now try to transfer this geographical approach to the map of continental Europe and imagine the relations of conflict between economies and classes that intertwine or could intertwine within such a network of mutual influences and attractions. When Budapest was the second capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it exerted its attraction over an area of some 130,000 square kilometers. We are talking about the end of the last century. Imagine today, without touching here on the problem of telematic networks and information highways, what might be the area of attraction not of cities such as Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Paris or Milan over the surrounding areas, but of the entire territory enclosed and included between these poles and the rest of the continent. Let us establish an imaginary line that, after the events of 1989 and German reunification, delimits this area towards the east. It begins in Hamburg-Lübeck, descends towards Berlin, and continues on to Prague, Budapest, Vienna, and Trieste. Last but not least, do not forget the very high rate of urbanization and urbanization to the west of this line. There are two questions to be formulated at this point. 1. Is it or is it not legitimate to speak of a peripheral area, but not a detached area, with regard to the European territory extending beyond this line eastwards to the borders of the former USSR and southwards into the Balkans? 2. Is the resumption of the Balkan Wars, which we have witnessed since 1991, to be considered as a product of local history and the maneuvers of a super-imperialism, or are the secessions, military clashes, field deployments and, ultimately, the events in Albania nothing more than the surface response of the profound telluric movements in the economic and financial spheres that have been transmitted from the center of capitalism to its periphery? If the correct answer to the first question is yes, and if the second hypothesis is correct for the other, then what is the point of a watchword like, get imperialism out of the Balkans? Whoever proposes it today, while perhaps proclaiming himself a Marxist, has not even read the ABC of Grandfather Lenin who, again in that 1916 text, already stated, the colonial policy of the capitalist countries has completed the grabbing of unoccupied land on our planet. The world for the first time appears completely partitioned, so that in the future only a new partition will be possible, i.e. the passage from one master to another. This is because, again according to Lenin, there is the tendency of finance capital to enlarge its economic territory, and also its territory in general. Finally, to avoid any mystification, he further specifies, it is characteristic of imperialism precisely its eagerness not only to conquer agrarian territories, but also to lay its hands on heavily industrialized countries, since in the first place the fact that the land is already partitioned compels, when a new partition is in progress, to lay hands on countries of any kind, and secondly, for imperialism is the competition of a few great powers fighting for hegemony, i.e. for the conquest of land, directed not so much to their own benefit as to weaken the adversary and undermine its hegemony. Western and, in particular, German investments in Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans will be the subject of a forthcoming work, the results of which have already been presented to the Turing comrades. For now, it is sufficient to observe that from 1936 to 1986 Germany was the main trading partner of Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland, only in the latter case, and only for 1936, was it second to Great Britain, while after 1990 it became their first trading partner ever. The data already collected also confirmed this trend for the other Eastern European and Balkan countries, except for Albania, where the first trading partner and first investor country is Italy. So, which will be the hegemonic power in this peripheral area? And what appetite can international financial capital have for a city like Budapest, in which more than 30% of Hungary's entire population is concentrated? And if, finally, it turns out that already in 23 AD, in order to close off the center of Europe and isolate it from the sea, 8 legions were deployed on the Rhine and 5 between the Pannonian Plain, present-day Hungary, and the lower reaches of the Danube, what can one think of the deployment of the Western troops that is unfolding between Bosnia and Albania? There is no escape. The Kalashnikovs have recited their dirges, and the propellers of the Vittorio Veneto have ploughed the depths of the Valona roadstead for pulses that come from that ancient heart of capitalism mentioned at the beginning, through the arteries pumping money from private individuals and states, all equally in search of new opportunities and better investment conditions. The imperialism of 1916 still serves in 1997. Are we at the photo finish? As far as the convulsions of the periphery and imperialism of Zitalik stock are concerned, at the moment, yes. As for the consequences of this for the proletariat and communists, not yet. Monetary unification and social classes. If they peripheral areas are somehow destined to be simultaneously drawn into the vortex of the financial activity of the centrals ones and to be the momentary playing field for a game of distribution of resources, wealth and positions of strength of enemies that have not yet openly declared themselves as such, at the center the vast work of rearranging expenditure, redirecting investment and redefining the priorities of states is in turn beginning to reanimate the social body. One of the prerequisites given as fundamental for the resumption of a cycle of class struggles, namely the ruin of the half-classes, seems to be firmly underway. If European states, both as allies among themselves and as mutual competitors, are to embark on a program to restructure their activities, lay the foundations for a resumption of competitiveness and modernization of their production cycles, and devote funds and attention to the reorganization of their military apparatuses, this must necessarily be reflected in a worsening of the conditions of existence of the half-classes. In the best Keynesian tradition, private savings must be reduced, forced back into the markets in the form of risky stock market investments or in the form of simple purchases of goods and services. The lowering of the discount rate continually demanded by entrepreneurs for a resumption of industrial investment is inversely proportional to the interest small and medium-sized savers have in maintaining high rates to secure their deposits. The cutting of baby or limited seniority pensions transforms civil servants and skilled workers who already believed themselves safe with pensions and, perhaps, second jobs, back into mere proletarians with little or no reserves. The entry of automation and electronics into every area of service and administrative activities reduces the number of employees needed and leads those who do not lose their jobs back to carrying out operations with an increasingly factory-like discipline and timing. The travat, but sometimes also the aspiring manager, looks in the mirror and recognizes himself, willy-nilly, as proletarian. Hence the outcry, the protests, the attempts to maintain one's status, in order not to fall into the bedlam of the class from which one thought one had forever distinguished oneself. The forms of protest here are varied, blind, often nationalist or localist, from the lockout of small shopkeepers, to the generic marches of pensioners, to protests against immigrants or against the mafias. These struggles, and the organizational forms they may take may be symptomatic, as was D'Annunzio's movement after the First World War, but they are not a substitute for an authentic clash between classes. In a recent article published in the journal Illinois Mulino, Giulio Tremonti stated that with globalization, the poverty of the East has entered the pay envelopes of the West. For the European working class, the statement has a kernel of truth, in the sense that not only are the blows of the technological and productive restructuring of companies beginning to be felt, reduction of jobs, greater flexibility, but also the working and living conditions of the proletariat are beginning to unify across the continent. It has been said, they are beginning and not that they already are. The responses are still fragmentary and archaic. They are of defense of the workplace, of claiming legalisms and rights, such as the right to work, that capital seems to invent on purpose to then sweep away like fairy tales, which in fact they are. Yet when in Belgium and the Ruhr, as in this last period, demonstrations with a workers' component resume, with street clashes, or timidly the class tries to regain a space of expression outside those represented by trade union intermediation or parliamentary political representation, the bell of the class struggle can ring again. It is no coincidence that Belgium and the Ruhr are mentioned here. Perhaps some other episode could have been cited, but there one is, to paraphrase an American novelist, in the heart of the continent. A continent where the working class, as numerous as in any other area, has been divided, from the post-war period until a few years ago, not only by the borders of nations, but also by the fictitious division between East and West. A working class, the European working class, which especially in the center of the continent has demanded, with a capitalism mindful of the first post-war period, the presence of Russian and American army corps for its control, in addition to those already available from all the democratic governments. A working class that, even in conditions of the closest dependence on opportunism and Stalinism, from Mirafire in 1969, to Flins in 1968, to Budapest in 1956, to East Berlin in 1953, to Gdansk, Szczecin and Warsaw between 1970 and 1980, was able to give evidence of irreducible combativeness. In a possible resumption of the class struggle, what plays in favor of the European proletariat is its concentration, its proximity that could turn, as in other periods, into a factor of rapid propagation of struggles and organization. And what also matters for the proletarians of the neighboring continents is that large numbers of immigrants from the Near East, the Indian subcontinent, Africa, and the more disaffected areas of the East could learn valuable lessons from contact with such eventual experiences. And bring them back home. So, onward central bank governors, onward technocrats, onward unifiers of Europe, by treaty or by canon, it makes no difference. Do your duty, cut, slash, regroup and concentrate. Reappropriate even the plate of lentils with which you have bought social peace for decades. Help abolish the remnants of obsolete classes that for decades have strenuously defended their existence through the preservation of your governments. Do your duty, unify the world working class and help prepare the conditions for the ultimate demise of capitalism and wage slavery. The end of work. From the point of view of the economic maturity of society in view of its transition to a later socialist or communist form, it can be said that this maturity has long since been reached. By 1847, at the time of the Communist Party Manifesto, it was already historically given, as well as consciously ascertained by communists. And it has never been a revolutionary Marxist position to see the need for further growth, for a broader development of the productive forces in the developed capitalist social sphere, before the forces of revolution could and should politically overthrow capitalism. It is no coincidence that in several left texts it is said, with a formidable linguistic twist, that the capitalist form is already dead, no longer exists. Yet, after a century and a half, the capitalist form has not yet been overwhelmed, while the productive forces have not ceased to increase, to grow, the corpse still walks. We believe it is important to try to explain why the corpse still walks despite the fact that historically the occasion for its final burial has long since been determined. As a premise, let us do some gymnastics around some Marxian categories related to productivity. Let us start with the law of the tendential fall in the average profit rate. It relates, in the profit essay formula, the trend in the numerator of surplus value to the trend in the denominator of total capital invested, or, in an easier to understand form, the trend in the numerator of the exploitation essay, P of V, to that of the denominator elements of the same algebraic formula, which can be traced to the organic composition of capital, C of V. Historically, necessarily, and naturally, capitalism seeks better profit performance mainly through the introduction of new technology, new machinery, and new organization that allow a higher exploitation of labor power. Thus, a rise in the exploitation essay, i.e., allow for the application of labor power in ever-increasing shares for capital, for the share of surplus value in the final product as a whole. In other words, every technological innovation in production tends to raise the share of surplus labor relative to the share of labor needed. But the same process of technological innovation that raises the rate of exploitation, so beneficial to the trend of profit, by introducing more capital investment in machinery and thus increasing the share of constant capital in total capital invested, simultaneously pushes up the organic composition of capital. It is precisely this kind of dynamic that entails in itself the tendency for the average profit rate to fall. In order to obtain increasing masses of profit, it is necessary to mobilize more than proportionately increasing masses of capital, of investment. Of course, this process, necessary in that it is not a matter of choice from which the individual capitalist or the system as a whole can escape by subjective will, involves, if we see it over a medium to long period, an uninterrupted growth of the social productive force. the individual capitalist's pursuit of a better return, of a greater profit, entails a greater investment in restructuring, in machinery, in technology, etc., and this entails, at the level of the system as a whole, a continuous raising of the productive forces present in society. This continued process entails a difficulty, the downward trend in the average profit essay, because it normally causes a rise in the organic composition, as mentioned above. However, the rise in productivity is not in direct correlation with organic composition, it is not directly a function of it. Organic composition is a ratio of value between the two constituent elements of invested capital, namely constant capital and variable capital. What, on the other hand, measures social productive force is not a ratio of value but is a physical ratio. It is the technical composition of capital, that is, the physical ratio there is between the actual production workers, the laborers, the quantity of machines they are able to operate, the quantity of commodities, products, use values they are able to produce, to realize. This last physical ratio is the true indicator of productive force, which certainly has grown continuously throughout the evolutionary arc of human society, and has grown even extraordinarily in the recent arc of full capitalism, that is, from machinism onward. Not as rapidly, not in a directly proportional way does the organic composition grow. Why? Because the same processes that lead to the increase in productive force, and thus to the devaluation of the individual products that are produced in the capitalist system, also lead to the devaluation of the means of production themselves, of Marx's Section 1 goods, those that go on to constitute the constant capital in subsequent cycles of production. In short, that same increased productive force which, applied in the spheres of production of mass consumption goods, of so-called wage goods, devalorizes them by contributing to raising at one and the same time the rate of exploitation and the organic composition, and, applied in the spheres of production of the means of production, causes their devaluation by tending to contain the growth of the organic composition or even to cause it to decrease. This is a complex and contradictory phenomenon that Marx was well aware of, one of the causes antagonistic to the fall in the profit rate that Marx illustrates and discusses in the third book of Capital. In certain periods, the devaluation of the constant element of invested capital is so strong that it can cause the organic composition to fall, while continuing the technical composition of capital to grow forcibly, in the forced race for greater labor productivity. This is what seems to have happened over the past 2 decades in the capitalism of the Western metropolises, after the steam engine revolution in the late 1700s and the electrical revolution in the late 1800s, the so-called third technological revolution of capitalism, the one related to information technology and telecommunications, seems to have had such a significant, continuous and extensive impact on the average spheres of the means of production of world capitalism that it has temporarily lifted the fortunes of the average profit essay. At a meeting of ours almost 15 years ago, in November 1983, the focus was placed, starting from the aggregate data that current statistics made available to us, on the trend not of the profit essay, which is not easy to measure directly, but of the accumulation essay, which is more directly inferable from the data of the increases in industrial production of the different countries. 6 were examined. The main ones, US, Japan, Germany, France, England and Italy. Out came a beautiful table that, following the movement of this essay inferred from the statistical data available since the beginning of the 1900s, showed how the oscillating curves of individual countries had radically contrasting trends up to the whole of the 1960s, partly because of their different roles and successes in the world wars, while equally clearly showing how they had, with the beginning of the 1970s, come into synchrony. All that swinging, quite hysterical, of curves had converged into a uniform trend in which the single curve diverged from the others by very few percentage points, or even tenths of a point. This was the first phenomenon we pointed out, the synchronization of accumulation cycles at the world level, at least among the major countries. As a second relevant phenomenon, we observed that this synchronization had manifested itself at values close to zero, that is, the accumulation rates of the major countries had become uniform in a range of about -4% to +4% annually. This had been the case since the early 1970s, but with an impressive bottleneck in 75, all the curves in correspondence with that year pass almost at the same point, which gives us an opportunity for a brief parenthesis concerning the all too often cited erroneous prediction of the left, which had set around 1975 a turning point in the capitalist system, whereby a revolutionary crisis could be expected precisely on the basis of material causes, i.e., the uniform maturing of the accumulation contradictions of the world capitalist system. Well, while this prediction evidently did not find confirmation from the point of view of revolutionary success, which there was not, it did, however, demonstrate the formidable ability to antisight into the economic structure of the capitalist form. Capitalism would reach a point of malfunction, of overall jamming of the mechanisms of accumulation. And this overall jamming, no longer differentiated in time and space, at least in major areas, seemed evident to us to the extent that in one of our papers on these issues we spoke, perhaps exaggerating a bit, of a flat cardiogram of capitalism. 20 years after the fateful 1975, one cannot help but see that the corpse still walks. The cardiogram was almost flat because in reality there has been a material redetermination of profit possibilities, of the ability to resume making profitable investments for capital. The explanation in its general terms has been known to us all along. There is no possibility of a transformation in continuity, of an evolutionary kind, from one social form such as capitalism to the next, just because all the material preconditions are ripe and overripe. Without a powerful political and social rupture, the transition to a new economic form does not take place. And all the contradictions that we are highlighting here in the functioning of capitalism have in use always been They are not new. In a sense, it can be said that Marxists know them by heart and only strive to find them over time. The trivial fact that there was no revolutionary social rupture meant that necessarily capitalism could and should have gone on. This is in general terms. But what were the specific ways in which capitalism was able to move forward and relatively overcome that form of flattening of its accumulation capacity? We believe that it was precisely that element mentioned earlier, that is, this new technological revolution constituted a rejuvenating cure for capital, for its conditions of profitability, insofar as it devalued in a massive and rather generalized way constant capital in the main productive sectors. We shall see below some concrete examples in this regard. Let us now examine an example, with arbitrary data, to help us develop the thread of our considerations. Suppose an initial situation, row 1 of the table, in a certain sphere of production, say that of automobile production, the situation of the value elements, constant capital, variable capital, surplus value, and their ratios, profit essay, exploitation essay, and organic composition, and the situation of the physical technical elements, such as the number of employees and the number of cars produced, and their ratio, productivity measured in cars per employee, and finally a unit value of the car. Let us now hypothesize a series of variations to examine what happens. A typical case is the introduction of new technologies into the sphere itself, that is, new machines, new production apparatus that would lead to a massive increase in productivity in the sector. For fun concrete examples, let's remove the Fiat Mirafari plant and replace it with the Melfi plant. But we, in row 2 of the table, made a more arbitrary assumption, a doubling of internal productivity in the sector, because, for example, robots are introduced in certain places, etc. The effect of this kind of occurrence in the sphere is fully in tune with the law of the tendential fall in the profit essay. There is an increase in constant capital investment, there is a decrease in the unit value of the good in question, the car, there is an increase in surplus value, but there is a decrease in the profit essay. Everything squares with our expectations in this kind of scenario. Notes for reading the table. 1. Data are completely arbitrary, with no claim to verisimilitude. 2. The rows do not represent situations in logical chronological relation, but the first one represents a hypothetical starting situation. The others are all to be compared with the first, representing situations varied from that one. 3. The decrease in the value V of the labor force is explained by the decrease in the value of the car, which is also considered a wage good. 4. In order to understand the changes in the C value of constant capital, it is necessary to keep in mind that in the starting situation we assumed a situation of equal weight between fixed capital, plant depreciation, and working capital, raw materials. Let us now assume, referring to row 3 of the table, that productivity increases in an upstream sphere, in the sphere, for example, of sheet metal production, considering it, again arbitrarily, to be the main raw material in car production. Lo and behold, if there is a massive increase in productivity, and hence a strong devaluation of sheet metal, under the same production conditions in the sphere of car production, the third cause antagonistic to the fall in the profit rate identified by Marx emerges overbearingly, falling price of the elements of constant capital. This entails a benefit from the capitalist point of view within the sphere of production, i.e., a rise in the profit rate, precisely because, since the other production conditions have not changed, it entails a reduction in the organic composition. In the branches of equipment production, this entails a further reduction in the value of that particular type of commodity and thus a generalized decrease in the organic composition of capital. Referring to row 4 of the table, let us examine another scenario related to the introduction of production innovations not related to new machines, but to new production methods. In recent years, we have had our ears, and more, rattled by talk of quality systems, Japanese-style systems, re-engineering, total quality. There is no doubt that the Toyota model, if you want to call it that in the auto industry, more or less emphasized, mythologized, represents the effort that capitalism has made to reorganize production in a more efficient and productive way even in the sectors of heavy mechanics, metalworking, etc. In Turin for years there have been the Japanese as consultants to Fiat. In America the big manufacturers have fully espoused this model. In short, it is disrupting and changing the old, so-called scientific, organization of work, the Fordist-Taylorist one. Although in practice the introduction of new methods should never be separated from the introduction of new technological apparatus, one would theoretically be able to produce more machines even with the same technical productive apparatus combined with new labor methods. One could have productivity improvements, and this without necessarily growing in its own form constant capital. Finally, following row 5 of the table, we see what changes can occur in the productive sphere under consideration in the face of real technical innovations, inventions. The concept of the automobile is clear to everyone, that thing mounted on wheels which is capable of taking us for a ride. However, in measuring productivity in that particular branch of production on the basis of the number of automobiles per employee, an important consideration must be taken into account. Comparing an automobile of 30 years ago with one of the present day, we see that it in itself performs the same useful function, is comparable as its use value, but its internal technical structure has varied quite significantly. If we actually consider a mid-size car of 30 years ago and one of today, of equal range of utility, number of seats, luggage compartment capacity, etc., we can see that the car's internal technical structure has changed quite significantly. Although in today's one there are many more accessory features to justify maintaining high prices, the heated rear window, reclining seats, electric windows, it is certain that we measure a very different weight in kilos or quintals of the two cars. The old car was based on chassis and sheet metal, the new one is based on a thin sheet metal monocoque, with extensive use of plastic. To take a more obvious example, again relating to the latter scenario, the chairs we sit on during meetings. Let's go into that sphere of production, compare a current mold plastic chair with one from 50 years ago, and measure productivity in terms of chairs per employee in any given chair shop. We probably find exceptional productivity uplift indices, even 1,000 times higher. However, it is clear that it is completely different from the point of view of value, of human labor time contained, of value transferred, of the overall capital represented in a chair. If it is made of wood, it has a frame, it has its own saddlery, it has padding, it has nails hammered into it, it is a rather complex object. If, on the other hand, the chair is made of plastic with a nice little mold, like the ones we have before our eyes, it is something else. It is certain that the worker in a modern chairmaker's shop will be able to produce as many as 1,000 chairs a day with proper machinery, but it is equally certain that the value of the circulating capital, that is, the raw material, which he transfers into the product over and above the working time, is enormously less than that transferred by the traditional chairmaker. If, for example, at one time half a man's day was crystallized in a chair because a worker could make 2 a day, and there was thus a considerable amount of valorization, it will have been true that in the chair value, wood, nails, cloth, upholstery of a certain magnitude was also crystallized at the same time. Now, in the assumption of plastic chairs, a worker will make as many as 1,000 a day, and therefore very little is crystallized in each chair in terms of value added, 1,000th of a man day. But also in terms of constant capital, of raw material, very little is transferred into a chair. In plastic it will be less than 1,000 liras. The above is by way of illustration, it is just to give a sense of the kind of investigation that has been done. After these examples, let us pick up the thread of the discourse begun. It is true that the formidable growth of productive forces in the capitalist epoch has put the system under the sword of Damocles of the tendential fall in the profit rate. It is also true that historically in some phases, and in this phase particularly, capital has been able to fight back by devaluing the constant share of capital across the board as well. Mention was made at the outset of the all too frequently mentioned ongoing technological revolution, mainly related to information technology and telecommunications. There are indeed remarkable effects in the sphere of the means of production, and 1,000 examples could be given. Let us look at one at random. In all industrial sectors, until not too many years ago, an important production department was that of draftsmen, either for the design part of products or for documentation. The investment per employee on draftsmen, even if only in terms of a drafting machine, wooden cabinet with ink pens, graph paper, etc., was relatively considerable. To give a dimensional idea, let us recall that in the 1970s at Fiat the draftsman's department still consisted of several hundred people working by hand on drafting machines. At a certain point, in the 1980s, there was a huge increase in productivity in this specific sector related to the introduction of electronic drawing systems, CAD, CAM, etc., on the first graphic workstations, resulting in the expulsion of almost all draftsmen. These were machines that entailed a considerably higher investment per employee than in the days of the drafting machine, on the order of 100 million MN. In other words, in full accord with the law of the tendential fall in the profit rate, there was a definite raising of the organic composition to increase productivity. Today, the same automatic design functions with that same productivity, or perhaps even greatly increased, are achieved with an investment per employee of 4, 6, 10 million at most, while drastically reducing the organic composition. Generalizing, it can be said that the actual dematerialization of entire production processes, even in cases where the product goods retains its physical consistency, but especially in cases where the final commodity product is embodied in a huge number of bits without any tangible physicality, as in the areas of information, documentation, drawing, design, advertising, etc., has actually led to a lightening of the C component of capital, and this has allowed for the resumption of profit. At the expense of what? We mean, it is certain that with this the capitalist system has not found the formula of eternal youth. Indeed, these phases of generalized technological innovation, of technological revolution, come at the expense of something, in the historical course of capitalism. Of what? First of all, they come at the expense of the ability that overall social capital has to employ labor power, a problem that, by hook or by crook, is the focus of attention of trade unions, political movements, political scientists, philosophers, consultants, of the much-quoted enlightened bourgeoisie, because by now, like a spectre, it agitates the dreams of a little of everyone. This enormous technological reconversion of the productive apparatus of developed countries has given birth to a baby of difficult social management, the expulsion from the world of work, not temporary, not toward parking in the reserve industrial army, but permanent, structural, of tens of millions of wage earners. In OECD countries, official statistics speak of 35 to 40 million unemployed. No one, not even among bourgeois analysts, expects a structural, systematic, continuous return from these numbers. On the contrary, there is increasing talk of a trend toward their further growth. Without arriving at any definitive theoretical conclusions, we have done since 1983, with our first notebook, some work that has raised no small amount of perplexity and has presented ourselves with not inconsiderable difficulties. We refer to the mathematical formalization work that hinged on the parabola, in the mathematical sense, of surplus value. It is boring work just enough for most of the fellows, and we certainly do not want to resume it here. But one element came out clearly: for Marxism, number of workers in capital valorization and mass of surplus value are not disjointed and disjointed entities. The ability that capitalism has to make relative exploitation of labor rise, increase relative surplus value, make the surplus day grow in relation to the necessary day, can historically compensate, within certain limits, for any absolute decline in the number of workers, of proletarians incorporated in the process of capital valorization. But only within certain limits, and this Marx was well aware of. Of course, today, we are not yet at the point where you cannot extract as much surplus value from one worker as you used to extract from 100, but we are talking about 35, 40 million proletarians from whom the capitalist machine of the most developed countries no longer extracts surplus value. Of course, there is to be taken into account that with the enormous growth in productivity, surely there is an enormous growth in the relative surplus value that can be extracted from each individual worker. From this relation between the number of workers engaged in the valorization of capital for capital, thus in the production of surplus value, and the mass of surplus value produced, we arrived in the form of theoretical mathematical induction at the conclusion that there is a point beyond which there could also be a reduction in the mass of surplus value, not only in the rate of accumulation, but in the absolute mass of surplus value. Has such a point already been reached? Is it getting there? Are we getting there? Is such a thing compatible with the very survival of the capitalist system? These are heavy and open questions. We at the time said yes, that such a fact is theoretically conceivable. Certainly it would not be normal, best functioning conditions for capitalism, those in which the total mass of surplus value produced in each cycle did not grow or even decreased. However, for capitalism to function, for capital investment to take place, the essential thing is that the individual capital invested should measure an increase in surplus value, and this even in the presence, possibly, of an overall decrease in the mass of social surplus value, that is, with the parallel expulsion from the accumulation cycle of other capital that can no longer invest itself. Let us observe in passing, from these problems comes another one, which we will have to deal with and which has often been posed to us from the outside as well, that when we talk about these figures, employment, investment, GDP, we are always talking about the most developed part of the world, but there are many other areas which, although at a lower level of capitalist development, are nevertheless already abundantly developed from the capitalist point of view and churning out surplus value at full speed. It is certain that in Korea, in Formosa, in immense China itself, the accumulation curve will be much brighter today than in the old developed world. The mass of surplus value will be continuously growing, given the youth of those capitalist systems. For large numbers, however, it seems that the number of new employees in those emerging countries does not compensate for the loss of jobs in the more developed countries. It should be noted, however, that capitalism develops in national spheres, and in some of these spheres, the older and more developed ones, the accumulation difficulties we are dealing with have already partly manifested themselves and are to be explained. The first cost of this greening of the conditions of profitability for capitalist investment, we have already pointed out: capitalism can no longer occupy, and thus exploit, the same amount of men, of proletarians, that it was able to exploit in its previous history. In capitalism there has always existed a tendency for the productive force to grow, and this has entailed the conquest of new spaces for profit. Consequently there has always been a tendency toward an increase in the organic composition, but this tendency has hitherto been more than compensated for by the enlargement of the productive base, and the correlated enlargement of the industrial proletariat, or at any rate of the proletariat in the overall sense, so that the mass of surplus value produced has not ceased to increase on average. We now seem to be moving to a stabilized tendency toward a decrease in the number of those employed in the valorization of capital. This is an absolute novelty, observable for some years in developed countries. From the point of view of the individual capitalist, it can only make one rub his or her hands together that he or she has a very high productive output with very little labor employed, a very high rate of exploitation, especially if the average conditions of production in the industry are less developed and allow the acquisition of profits and surpluses in a manner tangibly satisfactory to the capitalist. But those conditions of competitive advantage cannot be final in any sector, not even for a Luciano Benetton. Sooner or later the whole garment sector will adopt those same techniques, and this will simply be reflected in a generalized lowering of the value of those commodities, and thus will tend to crush the rate of return on capital, profit essay, throughout the sector. The problem of the ability of the system as a whole to provide work is already a fairly dramatic social problem today. The whole host of bourgeois politicians, all the enlightened scientists advising them, harp laboriously on the problem of a future described in gloomy terms, unless political solutions to the progressive expulsion of labor power are found. Of these gloomy predictions, many could be cited, those of Ruffolo and Galeno in Italy, those of Rifkin and Alain Mink abroad. We quote one that is quite symptomatic of the attitude of these gentlemen. It is taken from the work of an American, stuffed with 1,000 fascinating and sometimes misleading examples. In it, not only is the reabsorption in the near future of this expelled labor force not expected, but a radical worsening is predicted to the extent that the phenomena of rationalization, let us call it productive efficiency, will penetrate even the sectors that in the past guaranteed its partial reabsorption, the sectors of the famous advanced tertiary sector, services, public administration, etc. Although still in its infancy, the third industrial revolution has already led to the marginalization of tens of millions of workers in agriculture, industry, and the service sector. New technologies have paved the way for a revitalization of the global economic system along high-tech lines, with a concomitant reduction in the labor force globally needed to produce goods and services. Yet the current wave of automation and re-engineering represents only the pale simulacrum of a technological transformation that is set to increase productivity enormously in the years ahead by making an ever-increasing number of workers redundant and irrelevant in the economy. J. Rifkin, The End of Work, 1995, page 266. Never mind certain phantasmagorical projections reported in these works, and assumed 70% of the unemployed among working-age adults, we are interested here in the signal of how the problem of rising unemployment is experienced by the bourgeoisie. It is dramatic precisely from the point of view of capitalist administrations, because it actually puts out of action the whole mechanism by which the bourgeoisie had managed to contain the great revolutionary crisis at the beginning of the century, the fine-tuning of fascist, or Keynesian whatever, policies aimed at ensuring both social control and the stabilization of the economic operation of the capitalist machine was based on the fact that, through public activities of deficit spending, the direct assumption by the state of services that had previously been the prerogative of mutual assistance associations, the construction of the state pension, health, and school systems, all of this had also ensured a flywheel of uniformity and continuity in the production of income and thus in the domestic consumption capacity of individual countries. Keynes' rule is well known, never mind how theoretically well-founded it is. Demand must be created to get the capitalist economy, grappling with the long depression of the 29-35s, back on track. Well, today this rule is difficult or impossible to apply, given the speed with which the economy economizes on labor in all sectors, productive and unproductive. We mentioned earlier the dematerialization of production, achieved thanks to the continuous inventions and technological innovations that science, now completely reduced to a productive force for capital, has continued to churn out in a continuous stream. The concrete result of this generalized phenomenon makes it difficult to compare use values even a few decades apart. We mentioned above some notable changes found in durable goods such as automobiles. But much more conspicuous are the distances between woolen garments of a few years ago and today's garments made of synthetic fibers such as fleece, or between a 33 RPM vinyl record of a decade ago and a present-day CD, and even striking is the comparison between a 1950s calculator, occupying rooms for hundreds of square meters, with dozens of linear meters of metal furniture containing panels full of components. Just think of the memories in use until the early 1970s, a ferrite core for every bit, magnetic tapes or low-capacity hard disks, etc., with a present-day server, suitable for holding processing for dozens or hundreds of jobs, with hundreds of bytes of central memory and dozens of bytes of disk, and confusable dimensionally with any personal computer. If it is so difficult to compare corresponding usage values, it is equally difficult to compare real productivity over time. The number of computers of a given power output produced per employee has grown, in the age of microprocessors and integrated circuits, by several thousand times, while the unit material content of the same computers has certainly dropped by a few hundred times. And qualitatively similar considerations could be made about the spheres of production in which plastic has taken the place of wood, fleece the place of wool, etc., etc. In short, the increased social force of production, which can be measured in the geometric growth of the use values produced, has not led to a proportionate growth in the value of constant capital either in its fixed capital component, plant and machinery, or in its working capital component, raw materials, energy, depreciation. In practice, the very lightening in terms of the weight of commodities, on the one hand, and on the other, the replacement or upgrading of much of the plant apparatus with a low-cost commodity such as information technology is today, have functioned as a rejuvenation cure for capitalism. A significant part of constant capital C is devalued, millions of workers are expelled, and variable capital V is lowered as a result. But in the end, the cost of this newfound vibrancy of the capitalist system would seem clear if both C and V fall. So does the capital that is able to invest itself, and this is a specific contradiction in which capital struggles at this stage. On the other hand, for the purposes of the good yield of surplus value production, the rise in productivity nevertheless has a characteristic and limitation that Marx had already noted. It always brings about a simultaneous increase in surplus value, but not in a proportional way, indeed, in a way that is all the less than proportional the more mature, developed, the average previous productivity of society is already. We quote from the Grundrisse, Ein Audi, New, Volume I, page 294, only the passage in which Marx gives the most striking example of his reasoning, assuming a situation of already highly developed productive force, in which the necessary labor was already reduced to 1 in 1,000. This is probably not the present case, but certainly in certain sectors, we are already at 700 to 800% exploitation rate. Note that here Marx speaking of productive force refers exclusively to that of the spheres of production of consumer goods. If the necessary labor were already reduced to 1,1000, the total surplus value would equals 999 to 1,000. If at this point the productive force increased 1,000-fold, the necessary labor would be reduced to 1 to 1,000,000 of a working day, and the total surplus value would amount to 999 to 1,000,000 of a working day, whereas before this increase in the productive force it amounted only to 999 to 1,000 or 999. 0,001,000,000. It would thus have increased by 999 to 1,000,000. That is, it would have increased by less than 1,000th. In the following quoted passage Marx gets the calculations wrong, but it remains demonstrated that under those already highly evolved conditions, a 1,000-fold increase in productivity would result in an improvement for capital, in the extraction of relative surplus value, of scarce 1,000th. The mountaintop of 1,000-fold growth in productivity would give birth to the mouse of 1,000th increase in surplus value produced. The argument is led to paradox, but it is very useful in understanding the point Marx wants to make here. The growth of productive forces, which even capital cannot help but cause, has diminishing beneficial effects as the average conditions of capital production mature. Marx summarizes it this way, Ibid page 295. The surplus value of capital does not increase by reason of the multiplier of productive force, that is, by reason of the number of times productive force, posed as a unit, as a multiplicand it increases instead by reason of the surplus of the fraction of the day's living labor, which originally represents the necessary labor, over this same fraction, divided by the multiplier of productive force. And again, Ibid page 296. The greater the surplus value of capital before the increase in productive force, that is, the greater the amount of surplus labor or surplus value of capital presupposed, or, in other words, the smaller the fraction of the working day that constitutes the worker's equivalent, which expresses the necessary labor, is already, the less increase in surplus value capital obtains from the increase in productive force. Its surplus value increases, but in a diminishing ratio to the development of productive force. The more capital is thus already developed, the more surplus labor it has created, the more formidably it must increase its productive force in order to valorize itself, that is, to add surplus value, only to a modest extent, since its limit always remains the ratio of the fraction of the day expressing the necessary labor to the whole day's labor. It can only move within these limits. The more the fraction concerning necessary labor is already reduced, the greater the surplus labor, the less any increase in the productive force can appreciably diminish necessary labor, since the denominator is enormously increased. Self-valorization of capital becomes more difficult to the extent that it is already valorized. The increase in productive forces would become indifferent to capital, and so would valorization itself, since its proportions have been reduced to a minimum, and it would have ceased to be capital. In other words, it is a matter of what we were saying earlier, the benefit to capital, in terms of an increase in surplus value, does not occur by direct reason of the grafting of new productive force, but by reason of the extent to which such grafting improves the previous situation of the division of the workday between necessary labor and surplus labor. We believe it can be taken for granted that the average of this ratio in developed countries is considerably lower than a century and a half later when Marx was writing, note, lower because we are talking about the ratio between the parts of the workday, between necessary labor in the numerator and surplus labor in the denominator, thus higher in terms of the exploitation essay. Marx never gave numerical examples at random. If in his abstract examples he normally took 100% as the value of the exploitation essay, it was because he estimated that about such were the conditions achieved in England in his time. Referring to the 1950s, in the dialogues Amadeo estimated in turn that by then the labor required on the total day at Mirafiori was under 2 hours a day. Today it will certainly still be diminished. We are not at the 1:1,000 of Marx's paradox, but we are certainly already in a starting situation in which new grafts of productive force give relatively mild direct results of valorization for capital. On the other hand, they have very conspicuous social results, i.e., the continuous expulsion of millions of workers from the cycle of valorization of and for capital, with the consequent difficulties from the point of view of the circulation of goods and the realization of value. We derive from here a marginal observation. In the last century of capital's life, there has already been more than once a massive transfer of the employability of human labor power. First of all from the old primary sector, from agriculture, which still at the beginning of this century, in all Western countries, employed the majority of the working population. Today in all these countries the labor force is now reduced to 2 to 3% of the total. For long decades, however, this expulsion has been offset by an absorption of peasants into factories with an increase in blue-collar, industrial workers. Even that cycle of absolute expansion in the number of workers in the industrial or secondary sector ended as early as the 1950s-60s. Since then there has been a gradual decline, and lately a precipitous decline in the capacity to employ labor in all industries. For years bourgeois economists lulled and blissed themselves into short-term statistics that provided the comfortable illusion that this trend was again offset by the development of another sector, the tertiary sector, that is, the production of services of all kinds, then by the development of the advanced tertiary sector. Commercial services, financial services, and insurance have in fact been growing in activity and employment at a whirlwind pace for years, enough to offset overall the fall in employment in the first two sectors and overall ensure a tenuous but continuous growth in the overall number of employees, at least proportional to the population. By now, even the expansion of the service sector is a memory, and with the introduction mainly of information technology and telecommunications, we are witnessing, and more will witness in the coming years, a drastic employment contraction throughout the sector. And finally, past history has assigned a major role for employment stability to the bulge of the state apparatus and generally the non-productive public administration. One knows all the clichés about this great absorptive capacity. Now we see that the state and the entire public sector are also in the crosshairs as far as productivity growth is concerned, whether it is the new conditions of global competition related to the competition of the Asian model or whether it is any other variously theorized cause. It is a fact that all countries are setting themselves the problem of reforming the welfare state and rationalizing the state machine to make it more efficient. That is, they have begun to break, even legally, the taboo of the non-redundancy of public employees. Of course, the phenomenon is not uniform. In the United States it happened in one way, in Italy in another, in France in yet another. But everywhere the introduction of new technologies and new management methods in public administration, when not a given, have become a generalized project, a constant part of the program for any political force, to improve the quality and lower the costs of public services. It is obvious what can happen, what is happening, what will happen with the introduction of some computerization. The possibility of efficiency growth in terms of certificate per employee is staggering, and from many quarters one finds descriptions of truly apocalyptic scenarios for the coming decades in relation to the resilience of employment in public administration, and the predictions are that not only will this trend not be reversed, but that there will be an acceleration. We are certain of one fact: we are not describing a new form of capitalism, we are not in the presence of a phase involving theoretical innovations. Simply, certain contradictions in the capitalist system are gaining prominence. Among others, there is tremendous growth in the technical composition while containing and often downsizing the organic composition. This makes it possible for individual capital to measure an acceptable and sometimes satisfactory maintenance of the profit essay. But at the same time, this very fact may result in a relative and absolute reduction of wage earners and, continuing over time, may thus result in ever less growth or even a reduction in the mass of surplus value produced in each cycle. While the system remains efficient for individual capital, it becomes inefficient for the capital complex. An increasing proportion of capital can no longer invest itself in the form of real capital. What this set of phenomena will entail is another open question. Certainly it has entailed and is entailing an export in financial form of capital to new areas: China, India, Southeast Asia. Can such a movement compensate for this growing surplus, this mass of capital that is no longer able to exploit itself in its own form in the traditional areas of capitalism? Can it find profitable employment in the desired quantities in the new areas? When we made an examination, albeit not a thorough one, of the problem, our answer was no. The mass of capital being reasoned about is too large and the spread of productivity conditions in the globalization of markets is too rapid. To explain further, it is not that in those areas capital finds a virgin conditions in which it can invest itself with high labor density and low capital density. If one can use tools unchanged since the Neolithic period to harvest rubber, its processing is automatic. If one invests, even in areas that are not very developed today, in a very short time one will reach the same maturity of production conditions that exist in imperialist countries. It is not as if we can think of going to invest in China to produce there cheaply, for example, typical bamboo stools, probably still manufactured by some skillful stool maker who quickly knots bamboo planking or other material, perhaps helping himself with some fairly elementary machine. It is clear that within a very short time, and perhaps they are already doing so, the great mass of Chinese production of stools and chairs will be done with a plastic mold to meet the sitting needs of even 1 billion or more Chinese. So far we have tried to point out what are some characteristic connotations of capitalism's accumulation and valorization difficulties today. We have then mentioned what social consequences this causes, namely a massive, constant and permanent expulsion of wage earners from the production cycle. But what appears most important to our eyes is not so much the apocalyptic scenarios spoken of by the bourgeois scholars we referred to earlier. Later we will discuss the total divarication between our approach and theirs, but the fact that in these novelties is re-manifested, as it was already manifested a century and a half ago, the obvious contrast, actual, not just potential, that now exists between the level reached by the productive forces and the framework of legal, state, production relations that cage them. By now, all the policies we are talking about are blatantly inadequate to control capital and contribute to containing the productive forces, when they do not even contribute to restraining them. There are symptomatic cases of products whose marketability is guaranteed purely and simply by legal convention and forcing. Consider software products. There is absolutely nothing to justify the current cost of a license for a program except the legal norm that tends to prevent a user from getting hold of such a product free of charge, to have it at the touch of a button on any computer. Via the internet, then, one could have it available to an unlimited number of users, with the only precondition that each has an available PC. If software manages to be a commodity that yields over profit, it is only because international conventions and state laws are made that punish those who simply use these products, which materially cost little to produce and even less, indeed nothing, to reproduce. In telephony, equally good examples could be given. The use of telephone-type communication systems is paid for and billed at a price that now has nothing to do with actual costs, so much so that while the city time rate increases here, in the US the city phone call is free put in the cost of research and satellites, but the most expensive part of a phone call is now probably related to the technical administrative system of counting the clicks. There are numerous other such product families whose market price is supported by legal forcing. Think of music, performances produced in analog or digital form on tape, CD, etc. Anyone could copy a digital format of any kind from the internet at no material cost to anyone, other than phone shots, and it is laws that prevent this because there is copyright, or there is griffing of the original so that other copies cannot be reproduced from the matrix at near zero cost. The contrast of productive forces with the relations of production is also evidenced by another fact: the loss of jobs is producing a union and government policy of searching for lost time, the creation of jobs, the attempt to return to something that no longer exists. There is now a jarring contrast between an economy that is constantly expelling labor force, even though the productive force is in many ways restrained, and a social management mechanism that was once based on a stable relationship between employment, guaranteed in part by abundant government orders, and the state, the great regulator of an almost fully employed mass, in such terms that it could lubricate the realization of surplus value through a broad and widespread ability to purchase goods. In this stable relationship was identified the model that we can succinctly call Keynesian fascist. This model of social management is now no longer possible. Grapple all they want, not having alternative ones available. They go climbing on the glass of the creation of useless labor in order to keep up the social convention that in order to get to the benefit of being able to consume the social product, one must have a sticker guaranteeing that one has sweated, that one has worked, in order to keep up, crutching it badly. The value-labor relationship, which is one of the cornerstones of this mode of production, but which is no longer as adequate to make the whole mechanism of social reproduction work as it once did. And then you see things that are quite grotesque from our point of view, inventing totally useless forms of labor, and calling them socially useful, in order not to have to say that they provide free income, in order to try to contain this material force, this mole that digs in and asserts that production and social reproduction can no longer be based on the intensive application of labor, of the exploitation of human labor in a massified form. Certainly there are many other explanations of the great increase in non-profits besides the one above, but it is certain that even those being advanced by the various bourgeois foundations are very partial. As a matter of fact, taking their own figures for good, today 20 to 30% of the working-age population is enough to reproduce the entire society. In Italy, we are very modern, 36%. This, despite the more or less idealistic efforts of the trade unions in the past years, does not become a reduction to 20% to 30% of the average working day, but it becomes the super-exploitation of a minority and the marginalization of all the others. How can the contradiction be resolved? By having others do, they say, activities unrelated to capital appreciation, creating and expanding the sphere of socially useful work. In one of our letters we quoted one of those bourgeois who feel enlightened, Giorgio Ruffolo, who told the fairy tale of King Dagobert and his happy reign. He said, it will mean that those who will be excluded from productive activities, because they are supernumerary, will devote themselves to exquisitely unproductive activities, the performance of Mozart, the cleaning of historic centers or the opening of museums and libraries, leisure activities, entertainment. And they will be paid for, according to a rational plan, from the income of the productive sectors. But here the kettle falls. Why should such activities be carried out without applying the social productive force that society is capable of developing? It is an attempt to put a cage on it that will not stand the test of things. Let us go back to the example of music. In the production of records, some production companies already make music synthetically, that is, they record good performers separately, sample their sounds by means of computers, do the mixing of voices and instruments, even create voices and instruments, etc. If this is true there where a CD is to be sold on the market, who knows why for the bourgeois conception of leisure time millions of people should be set in motion strumming a bow or sweeping the streets with a sorghum broom. Let them do it for their own enjoyment, not to be entitled to a hard-earned consumer card, as long as they do not accept the social perspective, already grounded in the facts of today, of a society in which the value-labor relationship is no longer the prevailing norm. And our pundits, with the leftists in the lead, climb on increasingly smooth glass. If gigantic machines are used to clean and maintain a highway, why should unemployed Boy Scouts with a bucket and shovel be sent to clean historic centers? If you send them, dear Lima nodded, you get to pretend that there is an employment outlet for a large number of unemployed young people, but from the social point of view this is completely useless. However you disguise it, there is one fact: an enormous liberation of labor time, potentially made available to the human species as a whole, only grows in society, while dialectically manifesting itself to the honor of the capitalist world as an ever-worsening hell of exploitation for a minority of exploited workers in the production cycle and a chronic alienation for a mass of the unreserved, marginalized, more or less permanently excluded from the labor market. This is the form in which this contradiction manifests itself today. But the availability of time is now a historical product from which capitalist society can no longer withdraw on average. From the Grundrisse, Ibid page 720, we quote again. The creation of much available time for society as a whole and for each member of it, i.e., of space for the full development of the productive forces of individuals, and thus also of society, beyond the necessary labor time, this creation of non-labor time presents itself, on the level of capital, as of all those before it, as non-labor time, free time for some. And this is there for all to see. This available time that is freed up in society is not distributed equally, but manifests itself in the dialectically antithetical form of free time for some. In our case, then, free time is often unemployment. Capital adds to this the fact that it increases surplus labor time from the mass by recourse to all the means of art and science, because its wealth consists directly in the appropriation of surplus labor time, since its aim is directly value, and not use value. It is thus, unintentionally, an instrument for the creation of the possibilities of available social time, an instrument for the reduction of the working time of the whole society to a decreasing minimum, so as to make everyone's time free for personal development. But his tendency is always, on the one hand, to create available time and, on the other hand, to convert it into surplus labor. If the first thing succeeds too well for it, i.e. productivity growth and thus the creation of available time, it suffers from overproduction and then the necessary work is interrupted because capital cannot value any surplus labor. The more this contradiction develops, the clearer it becomes that the growth of the productive forces can no longer be tied to the appropriation of others' surplus labor, but that instead the working mass itself must appropriate its surplus labor. Here, as in so many other passages, Marx tells us that at some point this contradiction, inherent in the capitalist system, preludes and alludes to the communist transformation of society. It brings back the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the cage of the relations of production no longer sufficient to contain them. All this has, evidently and conclusively, superseded any trade union policy based on the old watchword, the workplace is not to be touched. There will be no more backtracking, except partial, momentary, ephemeral. You can have 1,000 demonstrations for the 100,000 jobs. Berlusconi can shoot his baloney about creating 1,000,000 jobs, but they are clearly either ephemeral or useless jobs. As we recalled this morning, classist positions are not always combined with self-consciousness, with clear purpose. Luddism, the labor movement that fought against the introduction of machines, was in fact a concrete manifestation of a strong social antagonism with which the working class was beginning to have consciousness. Of course, nowadays, any class movement manifests itself in improper forms per se, destined to remain within the sphere of bourgeois control achieved through official trade unions and their corporate or vague appendages. What chance did the British miners of 1980 or the German miners of 1997 have of keeping open coal mine shafts rendered useless and unproductive? Today, it is less important than before to have steel and therefore coal that is needed for blast furnaces, even taking into account that a lot of coke is produced from oil. Steel production has punctuated the production of everything that is now already dead labor, present on the capitalist Earth's crust. The lightening of products requires, in absolute terms, less steel. On the other hand, the introduction of new mining techniques and the exploitation of open-pit quarries in other parts of the world, which, by the way, requires fewer wage earners in the hell of tunnels, had produced the beneficial closure of the most lethal mines for proletarians. The manifestation of this kind of struggle is dead-end. They certainly represent an attempt to preserve something that is there, especially labor, but it has a worse meaning than a struggle against the introduction of robots or computers would have. The class struggle will therefore know its own revival, perhaps with partial goals, perhaps wrong from the class point of view, but its importance will be revealed by the extent of the clash and the overcoming of the present trade union formations and their policies. In this momentum, the content, the immediate claim, will also have to be overcome. To conclude, it is worth pointing out how much distance exists, in addressing the issue of the end of work, between us and the bourgeois scholars, who also, in increasing numbers, emphasize the problem, sponsoring various solutions. We think that there is no mechanism of a natural, evolutionary kind, whereby the accumulation of certain contradictions in the working mechanisms of the capitalist system, by its own internal capacity, can cause a natural and smooth transition into other social formation. That is to say, the fact that many bourgeois thinkers and consultants frame some of the obvious contradictions in the functioning of capitalism at this historical stage, does not at all imply that we come to the same conclusions. They mainly think about avoiding the possible, and for them undesirable, social consequences and strive to find miraculous remedies, which would solve these same contradictions, for example, by the extension at will of the third sector, non-profit or whatever. We, on the other hand, know two things well. First, that the transition to a new social form occurs historically only when the latent contradictions on the economic level between productive force and legal relations of production take the unfolded form of a social clash sufficiently radical, extensive and strong to reach, in the presence of the party, a political conclusion. Second, that in the absence of this there will be no substantive transformation. The most obvious specific contradictions will be resolved into deeper ones. The economic system will overcome its contingent major difficulties, adapting in some way, just as in 1975, at the time of the flat electrocardiogram of capitalist accumulation. There was automatically no social transformation of the mode of production into a higher form. Marxist science tells us that if the contradictions of the economic structure do not materialize in an unfolded social clash, in manifestations of open class struggle, formation and manifestation of the proletarian party, political revolution, dictatorship of the proletarian class, without all this there can be absolutely no true social novelty. Marx proudly claimed in this his true originality.